Every December, the eyes of the world turn for several days to the little town of Bethlehem, a small Palestinian city of less than 30,000, which has none of the markings we typically associate with a site of world historical significance. But it was in this humble place that, according to Christian tradition, the most influential person in history was born. Regardless of whether it actually occurred on December 25th, the tales of Jesus' birth have been central to the formation of Western culture in the 1700 years since Rome adopted Christianity. Even those who don't practice the religion know the story of the manger, the star, and the wise men. But despite our familiarity with the central characters and events of the nativity narrative, there is another dimension to the first Christmas that lurks just below the surface. A second glance at the gospel narratives in their ancient context reveals a bold political critique of Rome itself, stemming from Jewish writers invoking Hebrew prophets of old and cultural symbolism to condemn the foreign empire occupying their homeland. But before we begin in earnest, I want to note that while we discuss the content of the canonical Gospels of Matthew and Luke here, the video is not a commentary on their admissibility as faultless historical sources. We are instead addressing the Christmas narratives as reported by these works, and as accepted by the early Christian community, not whether the Gospels as a whole are factually accurate in the modern sense. Instead, we're reading them as indicative of attitudes of their times and analyzing the perspective of the authors. Because even if we concede that they don't perfectly relay historical facts, the works do perfectly convey the opinions of their authors. One must remember that unlike other regions under Roman dominion, tensions remained high in ancient Judea long after Roman conquest. The fundamental incompatibility between the worldviews of the polytheist Romans and the monotheistic Jews would lead to several armed uprisings, including the Great Revolt, which began in 66 and is alluded to by the Gospel authors. It is for discovering perspectives on this tension that the Gospels can serve as sources for the historian. Christianity was born through this conflict, and we can use the Gospels to analyze the attitudes of its earliest adherents without commenting on the possibility or veracity of the miracles contained within the texts. That incredibly complex and nuanced meta-discussion is all content for a different video, one we will never make. Now, with that disclaimer out of the way, how does Rome factor into the Christmas story? The first and most obvious reference to Rome in the Nativity story is that Luke opens his account by mentioning that all of this takes place during the reign of Caesar Augustus. This was a man who had deified his adoptive father Julius Caesar so that he could be known as a son of a god. In fact, Augustus was even hailed as a divinely sanctioned savior for delivering Rome from the perils of civil war. Cities across the Eastern Empire worshipped him as a god, and his pronouncements were known in Greek as Evangelion, or good news, which is the origin of our term gospel. Unsurprisingly, this is the same Greek word that an angel uses to announce the birth of Jesus to local shepherds. Luke was writing to a primarily non-Jewish audience, one that would have been familiar with the customary terminology used to proclaim the birth of new imperial heirs. Luke is consciously contrasting the humble circumstances of Jesus' birth with the pomp and power of the Roman emperor, who could command the movement of millions of his subjects with a single edict. The difference between these two sons of God could not be more stark. From the beginning, Luke also hints at the oppressive nature of Roman rule in Judea and the harshness of its exploitative taxation, themes that he would return to time and time again. Before Jesus is even born, Luke has set the stage for later conflict between Jesus and the Roman authorities, who would ultimately execute him as a rival monarch and political rebel. Hi, if you're enjoying the video, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, as doing so really helps us out. Thank you. The political overtones are even more pronounced in Matthew, and this should come as little surprise to us, as this gospel was primarily written with Jewish readers in mind, both in Judea and the wider diaspora. While Luke's criticism of Augustus is understandably quite oblique, Matthew uses the nativity narrative to criticize Herod the Great, a puppet king ruling Judea on behalf of Rome. Understandably, this collaboration with the hated Romans made him an incredibly unpopular figure, and even though Matthew was written decades after Herod's death, the venom directed at him is evident to all, indicative of the ill will that he inspired among those who ruled on behalf of Rome. Matthew's Gospel opens with the genealogy of Jesus, tracing his ancestors back to the Hebrew patriarch Abraham, making sure to highlight his descent from the celebrated King David along the way. This lengthy section may seem an odd way to begin a book, but Matthew's goal is to contrast Jesus as a true and worthy king of the Jews from Herod, who had family ties to Nabatea and Edom, and who could not trace his Jewish lineage back nearly as far as the illustrious pedigree which Matthew assigns to Jesus. Matthew is also the only gospel to feature the Eastern wise men, or magi, who follow a prodigious star to Bethlehem to worship a baby that they openly identify as King of the Jews. These foreign travelers even tell Herod to his face that the child is the rightful king. Herod seems to take this news surprisingly well, then deviously claims that he would like to worship this miraculous child in order to trick the Magi into revealing that the child was born in Bethlehem. Matthew then relates that in a bid to safeguard his power, Herod ordered the slaughter of all boys in Bethlehem under 2 years of age. Again, regardless of whether this massacre actually happened, its presence in the text is illustrative of the author's attempts to highlight the brutality of the puppet king. To avoid falling victim to this purge, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph evacuate to Egypt and remain there until Herod's death. This episode is meant to parallel the Exodus narrative, with Jesus in the place of Moses and Herod standing in for the Pharaoh. To a Jewish audience, there could hardly have been a more potent condemnation of the man. Matthew's portrait of Herod as a tyrant, the very definition of wickedness, and as a traitor to the Jewish people, is a proxy for a broader denunciation of Rome itself and its oppressive rule. Anti-Roman narratives pervade the Gospels, so it should be little surprise that we find them in the Nativity story. Though they become more concentrated as the story of Jesus' life progresses, the more direct criticisms are foreshadowed from the very beginning with these moments from the Christmas story. We must also remember that the culmination of the Gospels is the crucifixion of Jesus, a brutal punishment that was synonymous with Roman tyranny. Jesus' path to execution as a rebel against Rome is alluded to by both Matthew and Luke in their construction of events surrounding his birth. As I record this in December 2023, over 2,000 years after the birth of Jesus, the town of Bethlehem is again under occupation, and its residents are forced to live as second-class citizens with a much more powerful state exercising control over every aspect of their lives. In the midst of an ongoing war, churches across Bethlehem have canceled celebrations in solidarity with their fellow Palestinians in Gaza. Because the economy of Bethlehem is almost entirely dependent on tourism, this was a bold step, but surely the church leaders are hoping that at least for this year, the eyes of the world will turn to Gaza instead of Bethlehem. All I know is that when the people of Bethlehem sing Christmas carols this year calling for peace on earth, they will speak the words much more literally than the rest of us.